When asked, "What is your definition of personal success as an artist?" Richard Callner answered, 1. That other artists and lovers of art respond with enthusiasm and understanding to my work, primarily to the work that I feel is of major importance to me. 2. That it is and will be available in museums, galleries, etc., to be seen by the interested public. 3. If it is reviewed and or criticized, that it is written about constructively. And 4. When purchased, the collector feels that they possess an art object that is a significant part of their aesthetic life. Richard Callner, who lived from 1927 to 2007, was a major American artist and educator. He was the founding director of Tyler's School of Art in Rome. In much of his work, he explored the interactions of women and men through an invented mythical imagery. In putting this movie together, I have relied on the writings of Richard's son, David Callner, his friend, the playwright David Castelleo, his former student, the artist Frank Galuska, and Thomas K. Groff's essay for his 50-year retrospective at the Albany Institute of History and Art. His life's work as an artist would play out in 4 acts. His first major works depicted gross human figures and animals in generally dark and low-key colors. The works evoke the bitterness and frustration of one who grew up in Chicago during the Depression and served in the Navy during the Second World War. Certainly, as a Jew with Lithuanian roots, the legacy of the Holocaust weighed heavily on him. But there was another cause for bitterness. While Richard was serving in the Navy, his future wife, Carolyn Kunoshima, and her family, despite being American citizens, were being imprisoned in the Heart Mountain, Wyoming internment camp just because they happened to have Japanese ancestors. Richard had been drawing since childhood. After the war, he studied art on the GI Bill at the University of Wisconsin, the Académie Julienne in Paris, and finally the Art Students League and Columbia University in New York, where in 1952 he got his master's degree. So what was the aesthetic context of this, his first major style? When Richard Callner was a student, almost every artist was doing abstract work, and American galleries sold little else. But under the influence of the Chicago Monster School, he broke away from abstraction and began to paint the human figure. Here are paintings from 1952 that show this transition. Some of his subjects are biblical characters, and despite the bitterness, there are hints of humor. During his time in Paris, Richard was exposed to many of the major modernists and was especially taken by the surrealists. He was clearly influenced by Jean Dubuffet and by the existentialist philosophers of the time. Richard Callner said that these paintings are related to his feelings about the horrors of war, post-war depression, and frustration with people in power. His friend David Castelleo wrote, I first saw Richard Callner's work at Cambridge in England in 1959. I don't think then I fully understood what he was up to. I now realize, of course, that he was quietly challenging the viewer by showing the defective relationship between an intellectual and his body, as well as the timidities of society. After 10 years of creating these dark, angst-filled paintings, Richard embraced a female character who would be the star in his work for many years to come, Lilith. In 1960, David Castelleo spent a week with Richard and his family on the French Riviera and wrote. His work then was still somber and imprisoned. Richard has subsequently explained to me that it took him several years to transfer the Mediterranean light and color that surrounded him to his palette. In 1963, he and I were working together at Olivet College in Michigan. It was at Olivet that his work finally exploded into luminous light and where he first discovered the Lilith figure, which was to occupy his imagery for years to come. Richard Callner wrote, Lilith was an amazing creature, beautiful, intelligent, strong, and open to change and adventure. She was the angel that brought Adam to paradise, was Adam's first wife, Satan's wife, a medieval destroyer of children, and is said to have created an alternative line of children in opposition to the begotten of Adam and Eve. Richard also transformed Lilith into females from Greek mythology. Richard often used birds as stand-ins for men. The discovery of Lilith gave birth to a body of imagery that focused on freedom, humor, and independence, and an entirely new color palette. For much of this period, Richard was teaching at Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. Richard shared aesthetic objectives with his colleagues, most notably Rudy Staffel and Roger Anlaker. And if you want to learn about one of Richard's most devoted students, watch my movie, The Shadow of Icarus, artist Brett Taylor, and the school he founded on a Greek island. There is a fluidity in these works. And the bright colors are characteristic of many art movements of the 1960s, including pop art, op art, and hard edge abstraction. And yet these Lilith paintings are unique to Richard Callner's rich imagination and sensibility. A crowning glory of the Lilith period are the tapestries that an Israeli company made of two of his works. The great craftsman employed a total of 23 different dyes to correspond to the rich colors of his paintings. Richard's third period, consisting of landscapes, interiors, and still lifes, began shortly before he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1982. About this period, David Castelleo wrote, impressed by the plowed fields of Yugoslavia and the rows of olive trees in the Spanish hills, Callner, following Van Gogh's use of multiple perspectives, began to build external scenes with many horizon lines. eye comes to read the complex arrangement with perfect naturalness. Callner transforms interior space in a similar way to create Japanese-style rooms. He then combines his interior and exterior spaces to produce a psychic union between internal and external reality. This reference to Japanese-style rooms should not be surprising. Richard and Caroline had a long and happy marriage, which was blessed by a son, David, who lives in Japan and became a terrific writer, and a daughter, Joanna, who is now a lawyer and public official in Washington State. The family spent time in Japan, and the culture was deeply influential on Richard's work. I personally find his still lifes of this period very intriguing and oddly humorous. I believe he may have been somewhat influenced by Philip Guston. At least I see stylistic, if not subject matter, similarities. Certainly there's a playfulness in these richly ornamented works. As noted earlier, Richard Callner developed Parkinson's disease in the 1980s. In the last decade of his life, his work became more and more abstract. It also gradually became more painterly and expressionistic. In an email, Richard's son David was adamant about not wanting to sentimentalize the effect of the disease on his father's work. David writes that would, quote, ignore the great artistic heights of Richard Callner's fourth period, a common trap when addressing this man of courage. I asked artist Frank Galuska what he thought was going on with this final period of Richard's work. Frank wrote, "One can only guess, but it seems more likely than not that years of living with Parkinson's disease resting heavily on his life meant that mortality began resting heavily as well. Edging towards death affords rich opportunities to love those you love wholeheartedly. To create without restraint or second guessing. To lose oneself in the freshly born reality of each painting. So once Richard began considering letting go, perhaps he sought to paint in a way that both cooperates with and outwits limitation, rather than directly defying it. These paintings of the last style are exhilarating. They deserve to be looked at and looked into one by one. For all each of them has to tell us about painting, about art as a whole, and about life. To learn a lot more about this fascinating artist, go to davidcallner.com and scroll down to the section called A Guide. Here, David has compiled 5 PDFs with pictures and interviews that encompass his father's life and art career. It's well worth a visit.